Professor Robert Alter is the professor of Hebrew and Comparative Literature at the University of California at Berkeley, where he has taught since 1967. He has written widely on the European novel from the 18th century to the present, on contemporary American fiction, and on modern Hebrew literature. He's especially well known for having written extensively on literary aspects of the Bible. His 22 published books include 2 prize-winning volumes on biblical narrative and poetry, and award-winning translations of Genesis and of the 5 books of Moses. In 2019, he published the Hebrew Bible, a translation with commentary. Please join me in welcoming Professor Robert Alter to CSP Zoom. Thank you.
Okay, as you may be aware, I was on this project for a long time. I mean, almost a little short of 25 years. And when I did the first volume, which is just Genesis, back in the later 90s, I had no idea I was going to do the whole ball of wax. And I undertook Genesis as a kind of experiment, thinking maybe it won't work, but it worked better than I thought it would as I went on to do other volumes. And look, I ended up doing the whole shebang. Well, now I seem to have gone off screen, or do you still see me? Okay, good.
I see you. I'm just, I'm turning myself off so that the focus is on you.
So when my Genesis came out, my nephew, who's a very smart man, turned to his mother, my sister, and he said, "Why is Uncle Robert translating the Bible?" Which is a question that might occur to anybody. That is, it's the most translated book in the English language. Why another translation? And the basic explanation is that there's something seriously wrong with the existing translations. And I'll talk about that for just a few minutes, and then I'll try to illustrate what I have attempted to do. I don't think I'll have time to go into all the examples I would like, because I do want to leave an opportunity for Q&A. So my experience as a translator is that it was wonderfully satisfying because it was an opportunity to conduct 2 love affairs simultaneously. That is, a love affair with the Hebrew language of the Bible and a love affair with the English language. And what I find in the available translations is that there is no love for either. I'll begin with and by the way, I know that probably most of you read the Bible in the Jewish Publication Society version that started appearing in the mid-1960s and was completed in the latter half of the 20th century. And other denominations also undertook translations by committee about the same time, Protestants and Catholics. And there are actually at least a couple of authorized Protestant translations. Well, the first thing is that these translators show no love for the Hebrew of the Bible. And what I mean is this: they all have studied biblical Hebrew very scrupulously. In this country, they have PhDs in biblical studies from places like the University of Pennsylvania, Harvard, Yale, the University of Chicago, and so forth. And so they know their P's and Q's. That is, they know other ancient Semitic languages. They've scrupulously studied the grammar of biblical Hebrew and so forth. But it remains an object of study, not something that you relish the way you relish Shakespeare's English when you read Shakespeare or hear Shakespeare perform. And that is part of my contention, that the the Hebrew of the Bible is at its best, and is very often at its best, a delight to the ear and the eye. And it's not just that it's an aesthetic pleasure, which is on top of the religious content of the texts, but that the literary fashioning of the text is the vehicle for conveying, and conveying with a precision that you wouldn't get otherwise, the religious vision of the writers. So that's in terms of the lack of love of the Hebrew. Lack of love of the English, and I'm almost baffled by this, but the modern translators of the Bible, and I definitely include the JPS people, I knew a couple of those people personally, shows a tin ear for English. It's as though they've been in some kind of scholarly bubble, and they have very little sense of what's going on in literary English. They haven't read James Joyce and Virginia Woolf and William Faulkner and many others, Saul Bellow, who've been doing spectacular things with the English language. So, but by the way, I have to make a partial exception for these sweeping generalizations with the King James Version. The committees assembled by King James in the 17th century that put together the King James Version had a very good sense of literary English. I think the difference is it's all special teams now in the world of knowledge. So if you're getting a PhD in biblical studies, you do philology, you do archaeology, you do ancient Near Eastern languages, but you're not reading or steeped in the best that's going on in literary English today, whereas that was not true in the 17th century. And so they have a good ear for literary English, but then there are all kinds of egregious faults. To begin with, their knowledge of biblical Hebrew is rather imperfect, and there are some real howlers and continual mistakes, I would say. And then the translation actually is uneven in that there are wonderful lines of poetry, and then lines that just sprawl and are flat and don't sound like poetry at all. And I think this has to do with the fact that they were deciphering Hebrew from these Christian humanists, from the printed page, rather than listening to the sound of the Hebrew. Okay, so much for the King James Version. Now, I'd like to put forth an agenda for translating the Bible, which was the challenge I tried to meet. I have to say, I didn't always meet it. That is, when you're translating any great work of literature, you're suffering badly from delusions of grandeur if you think you've hit it bullseye. That is, you can't quite get what the original does. You can come close when you're lucky, and sometimes there are features of the original that just don't lend themselves to translation. But these were the challenges that I tried to meet. First of all, rhythm. Now, everybody knows that poetry is supposed to be rhythmic, but people don't really think very much that good literary prose has to be rhythmic too. I would say that on the whole, the translations, the modern translations of the Bible, suffer from arrhythmia, like a heart that's about to fail. So what you have to imagine is something like this. Fantasize for a moment that the manuscript of Moby Dick fell into the hands of an interventionist editor. And he said, well, this is a pretty good story, but I can make it better. Where Melville writes the whale has no face. I'm going to make it a little more elegant. I'll say the whale exhibits no countenance. That would destroy Melville's sentence. And what this crazy editor would take out is all the wonderful cadences that are reminiscent not only of the King James Version of the Bible, but of Shakespeare and Milton. And that's very important for the experience of Moby Dick. Otherwise, you get something like, well, this is a pretty good story about a crazy whaling captain, and I follow it through. But you don't get a sense that this is a sublime epic in prose. So this is a thing that hit me. It hadn't hit me before consciously in the very first chapter of Genesis when I set out to translate it. There's, you get to the verse which describes the creation of the heavenly luminaries. And what I did in my first and final version was to represent it as follows. God created, and then the great light for dominion of day, and the small light for dominion of night, and the stars. Then I stopped myself close. Why did I do that? Why dominion? Well, first of all, because everybody translates it as to rule over, to govern, and the worst of all, this is an illustration of tin ear, is JPS, which translates as to dominate the day and to dominate the night. Now, the Soviet Union dominated the smaller states of Eastern Europe after the Second World War. That's the way you use dominate. You don't say that the sun and the moon dominated the day and night. It's just a shaky sense of English usage. But there's something else that dominate destroys the cadence. Because, and I realized that for me, the compelling motive for saying for dominion of day, for dominion of night, is that it reproduces the cadence of the Hebrew. Because the Hebrew sounds like this. I'm going to just recite these words in the Hebrew. Et ha'ma'or ha'gadol lememshelet hayom, v'et ha'ma'or ha'katon lememshelet halayla, v'et ha'kochavim. And again, my translation, the great light for dominion of day, and the small light for dominion of night, and the stars. You see, it's almost the same cadence as the Hebrew. So you might say, well, why is that important? That's kind of a fussy thing that professors of literature care about, nobody else cares about. Well, you don't have to care about it, but it's part of your experience of the biblical story. Why is it that way in the Hebrew? Well, the priestly writer who's responsible for this version of creation had a vision of creation rather different from the second version of creation that starts in chapter 2, in which everything falls into place in an orderly fashion. The creation is a series of choreographed steps that express God's supreme control of a harmonious world. And the cadences את המאור הגדול לממשלת היום, ואת המאור הקטון לממשלת הלילה, ואת הכוכבים, are a vehicle that convey to the listener subliminally. Remember, these texts were read out loud in the ancient world. Convey to the listener subliminally the sense of order and harmony, which is very much part of the writer's vision of creation. So, okay, now I'm going to give an example from poetry, from Psalm 19, which is basically a Thanksgiving psalm. Apparently, the speaker in the psalm has had a nearly fatal illness and has recovered, and he thanks God. So he recalls the prayer of desperation he uttered to God in the time of his illness. And there's a line that reads like this in the King James Version, and most of the moderns follow it. What profit is there in my blood? That's just a half line of poetry. Now, by the way, the moderns all substitute for blood death, which I think is a little simple-minded. There's one bizarre assumption of the modern translators that modern readers can't understand metaphors. So they rather consistently convert the metaphor in what they think it refers to. And I think this is a kind of dumbing down of the biblical text and a condescension to the reader. And I never condescend to readers. I think readers can be very smart. So, what profit is there in my blood? Listen to that. You hear it has no rhythm. In the King James Version, the words "is there" are in italics. Why in italics? They use that convention, the typographical convention, to indicate words that are not in the Hebrew, but are only implied. They're very scrupulous about that. Now, it occurred to me, let me say this about biblical poetry. It's very compact. And I sought for all kinds of strategies to tamp down English and make it echo the compactness of the Hebrew. So one way was not to use polysyllabic words whenever possible. The second way was to eliminate all unnecessary words. So it occurred to me that you didn't need these there at all. Those are italicized two words. That is, my translation reads as follows: what profit in my blood? And the Hebrew sounds like this: ma betza bidami. So you see that the rhythms are identical. And this pounding insistence is very much part of the speaker's urgency and desperately saying, what gain do you have, God, from killing me? What profit in my blood? And now I'm going to come back to Psalm 30 in another connection in a few minutes. Okay, beyond rhythm, there is sound play and word play. The Bible is full of it, and it's often very significant, and you often can't reproduce it. Like, what do you do with a pun when you go from one language to another? Mostly, as a translator, you throw up your hands in despair. Occasionally, you can come up with something, and I will give you an example in a minute. But sound play is another thing. So, in the same Psalm 30, toward the end, the speaker says, First, I'm going to give you a very literal translation. And then what my solution was, which is not far from the literal, you have turned my mourning, mourning, my state of despair, in other words. You've turned, okay, I'm going to say my desperate condition, my mourning, you've turned my despair into a dance for me. The Hebrew sounds like this: Hafachta mispedi lemachol li. Now, the word for mourning or a chant of mourning is misped, mispedi in its declined form here. In modern Hebrew, misped means a eulogy, which is very close to the biblical sense. And the word for dance is machol. So you have misped machol. As I looked at that verse, I saw that the alliteration, two Hebrew words beginning with the letter mem, very close to each other, mispedi lemachol, right, was significant. It was important for the poet. Why? Because it was demonstrating phonetically to the ear, subliminally, that God had the power to flip a condition of great sorrow to a condition of joy, from machol, from misped to machol. So I stared at the verse for a few minutes, and then I got lucky. But as you know, you don't always get lucky as a translator, but I got lucky because I said, hey, wait a minute. There is a perfectly good English word for a chant of mourning that is both monosyllabic and begins with a D, which is dirge. You have turned my dirge to a dance for me. That made me very happy because I thought that I had got extremely close to the Hebrew. Okay, now I'm going to give you maybe a partial success. The prophet Isaiah was a virtuoso poet. Now, there are a lot of different prophets grouped together in the book of Isaiah, but Isaiah, the son of Amoz, who lived in the 7th century BCE, is a master poet. And he uses the resources of his poetry to convey a very powerful, insistent, prophetic message. And one of his ploys, because he wants to repeatedly show the extreme perversion of values in the kingdom of Judah of his time, is to juxtapose two words that sound almost the same, but are opposite in meaning. So he can go from positive to negative through two words that sound practically the same. So in Isaiah 5, you have the reference is God. He looked for justice. The word for justice is mishpat. And look, I'm sorry, he expected justice, mishpat, and look, a blight, mispach. So you go from mishpat to mispach. So I thought I would be betraying the force of the prophecy if I didn't do something with that word play. So what I came up with was he hoped for justice, and look, jaundice. Now, jaundice is a particular kind of blight, but I think it works well enough without misrepresenting the Hebrew. Then the next line, which is my solution was less successful. It continues that he hoped for, without repeating those words, for righteousness, staka, and look, a scream, tzaka. So it goes from staka to tzaka, and tzaka, scream, is a real shocker because it's so violent. Now, I couldn't come up with anything that quite equaled Isaiah's brilliance, but what I did, stretching things a little bit in the second part of the line, was for righteousness and look, wretchedness. Now, the Hebrew doesn't quite mean wretchedness, but you know, it's in the same semantic field. But what I lost, of course, was the sense of violence. But you can't solve all problems, and translating is a continual process of compromise. Sometimes the compromises are reasonably happy compromises, as here. In other places, they can be painful. Okay, let me go on to the matter of syntax. Yeah, I'm going to use all very brief illustrations to try to conserve time. So in addition to the pervasive use of parallel structures in the Hebrew, and Abraham sat at a tent opening, and Abraham raised his eyes and saw, and look, three strangers were coming. The and. I preserve that, as does the King James Version. But then there are other artful manipulations of syntax, word order, in the Hebrew. And here's one. When Jacob's sons return from their first journey to Egypt, and they give old dad the bad news that Simeon has been held as a hostage in Egypt, and that the man who rules over all of Egypt, of course it's their brother Joseph, but they don't know this, will not see their face again unless they bring down Benjamin. Old Jacob responds as follows in my translation. Me you have bereaved. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and Benjamin you would take. On me is all the burden. Okay, now I'll particularly focus on me you have bereaved. Most people would say, and certainly our friends on the JPS Translation Committee decided that this is not normal English word order, that you say, you have bereaved me, right? Or you use some circumlocution such as, it is I that you have bereaved, which is, you know, very pompous and starched in a way that the Hebrew is not. So why did I say, me you have bereaved? Okay, what does the Hebrew say? It says, oti shikaltem. Now, in biblical Hebrew, the normal way to say you have bereaved me is to take the verb and stick a little suffix, an accusative suffix at the end of it, which indicates me. It would come out as one word, shikaltuni. But that is not what the writer decided to do. Very unusually, he broke out the accusative pronoun me, which is oti in the Hebrew, and he stuck it at the beginning of Jacob's speech. Why did he do that? That is oti shikaltem. I'm convinced that he is the writer, a writer of great genius, is representing old Jacob as a kind of prima donna of paternal grief ever since Joseph disappeared. And he's constantly performing this role of a prima donna of paternal grief. So when he gets the bad news about Simeon and bringing Benjamin down to Egypt, it's all about him. So it's me you have bereaved. And at the end of the verse, on me is all the burden. Now, let me add the following about syntactic inversion in English. We don't do it much at all now, but it was, although Yoda, somebody pointed out to me, in these Star Wars movies, does it all the time. But it was very common in English poetry until the early 20th century, when English poetry turns to modernism and becomes more colloquial, or attaches itself more to colloquial English. So, for example, a poem that many of you may have read in high school, Keats's On First Looking into Chapman's Homer, begins as follows: "Much have I wandered in the realms of gold." Well, that isn't the way you say it in English. You say, "I've wandered much in the realms of gold." But Keats wanted to put the much out front. So he had "much have I wandered in the realms of gold," which is rather like my "me you have bereaved." And the fact that I'm invoking English poetry, which is almost now 2 centuries removed from us, but we still read it, is part of the goal of my translation. I did not want the Hebrew Bible to sound in English as though it were written yesterday, and as though it could come from a journalist contributing to your daily newspaper. I want it to sound older. Obviously, I couldn't make it sound 2,800 years older, which would have been insane. And I didn't want false archaism, but a slightly archaic coloration to the language, I think, gets you a sense of the dignity and the ancientness of the Hebrew Bible. Okay, let me try to hustle on to, maybe I'll take up word choice, and if I have no time for other categories, so be it. The Hebrew narrative doesn't use a lot of words. That is, for example, the Joseph story, which is one of the great stories in all of Western literature, takes up, what is it, about less than 20 chapters of the book of Genesis. And it would be maybe a 5% of the length of a modern novelist telling the Joseph story. In fact, you have Thomas Mann, who used 3 fat volumes to recreate the Joseph story in modern German in his trilogy, Joseph and His Brothers, which I was very taken with when I read it at the age of 19. When I reread some of it many years later, I thought, this is just too damn wordy. It's losing all the magic of the original story. So now, what does it mean that biblical narrative is so sparing in words? One thing it means is that each individual word has a saliency, a potency that it wouldn't have in a novel of, say, 150,000 words, which is many, many times more than the Joseph story. So here's an example. When in Genesis, when Hagar is driven out with her son Ishmael to the desert by David, following his wife's orders, the water skin that she's carrying with her water is exhausted. And she knows, after all, she's lived all her life in this region, that you can't survive very long without water under this blazing desert sun, and a child can survive maybe just a few hours. So she's convinced that Ishmael, her only son, is on the point of death. And she does something, I won't translate it yet. It's the Hebrew is vatashlichenu, to him under one of the bushes. So look at all the translations. They say she put him, she placed him, the best of all, but it's still not good enough, is the King James Version, is she thrust him under one of the bushes. But what does the Hebrew actually say? It's a verb, lahashlich, that has one meaning and one meaning only whenever it's used in the Bible. It means to fling. It's the same verb, for example, that Pharaoh uses in his genocidal order: every male child you shall fling into the Nile. So how do you translate this? You translate this as the way the Hebrew reads, and she flung him under one of the bushes. Well, the modern committees would say, oh, a mother wouldn't fling her child under one of the bushes, but they just have less imagination, less moral daring than the Hebrew writer. Because what he understands is that this poor mother, in a moment of absolute desperation, convinced that her son is about to die, in a kind of paroxysm of grief, flings him down and runs away. And all that is lost if you convert fling to put or lay down or some such thing. Okay, now there's the matter of nuance. There's a story, not much read in Sunday school Bible classes, in 2 Samuel 13, in which David's son Amnon conceives an obsessive lust for his beautiful half-sister Tamar. And his buddy advises him you want to get her, pretend you're ill, and get into bed and ask David to have Tamar bring you some food in your sick bed. And then you can have her alone in your chamber and do whatever you want with her. And of course, what in the event, what he does is he rapes her. It's a very brutal story. But now, there's a word for food here and a word for feeding. They come from the same verbal stem in the Hebrew, birya and lahavrot, that is used repeatedly in this story, and only in a few places. It's a very rather rare verb or noun elsewhere in the Bible. And all the translators render it as food, birya, food. And I thought, wait a minute. If he wanted to say food, the writer would have either said ochel or lechem, which is bread, but is used as a stand-in for all kinds of food in biblical Hebrew. But instead he chose this word, birya. So what's the difference? So I then went to my best friend as a translator of the Bible, which is a Hebrew concordance of the Bible. And I saw that in every instance in which the birya is used, it's the kind of food you bring to somebody who has been fasting or has been doing poorly. So it's like chicken soup. Couldn't translate it as chicken soup because they hadn't, alas, domesticated the chicken yet. So instead, I thought for a bit and I translated it as nourishment. Now you see, this is just a difference of nuance, but it's a difference of nuance that I think contributes to the force of the story. Okay, it looks like I'm not going to have time for further examples, but okay, just one last example for word choice. This is a kind of fun discovery. Sometimes you do discover things as a translator. In the Samson story, many of you will recall that there were 30 Philistine wedding guests imposed on Samson when he marries this Philistine woman, and he makes a wager with them. If they can solve his riddle, he will give each of the 30 a roll of fine cloth and a change of garment, chalifat begadim. And in the event, they wheedle out of Samson's wife the solution to the puzzle. He's infuriated. He goes down to Ashkelon and kills 30 Philistines and brings back not their chalifot, change of garments, but their chalitzot. So I said, wait a minute, what's going on? Everybody translates chalitzot as change of garments or tunic or something like that, because after all, those were the terms of the wager, and that's the word that appears that sounds quite like it with the difference of one letter when the terms of the wager are stipulated. Now, there's only one other place in the whole Bible where chalitzot is used for a garment, something you wear. And that's in the civil war between the house of David and the house of Saul after Saul's death. Abner, the battle-tried commander of the forces of Saul, is being pursued by the swift-footed Asael on the side of David. He knows he can't outrun him. So he says to him, turn you to the right or the left and strike down one of the lads and take his chalitza. That's the same word as in the Samson story. Now, the modern translators, all looking at the Samson story, take his garment, take his tunic, even take his belt, even though they didn't wear belts in the ancient Near East, and they get it dead wrong. The King James Version got it right because these were readers of Homer, and they were also readers of the Septuagint, who certainly read Homer. What do we know from reading the Iliad? When you're on the battlefield and you slay your foe, what do you take from him? You don't take his tunic, you take his armor. You remember how Achilles' armor is taken by Hector when he slays Patroclus, who's wearing Achilles' armor. So let's go back to the Samson story now. I'll go back very quickly in order to finish. It lights up an interesting point in the story. Samson goes down to the Philistine city, He doesn't kill 30 ordinary Philistines. He kills 30 Philistine warriors. And he brings back to the wedding guests 30, not changes of clothing, but 30 sets of armor, which is much more valuable. They see this, they also see he's killed our warriors. So it's a kind of warning to them of what he's capable of doing. He's kind of sticking it to these Philistines. It's a wonderful little moment. And you miss it if you convert the changes of armor into changes of clothing. So this is part of the fun and games of translating the Bible. As I've said, you never get it entirely right, but sometimes, I've given a few examples, you get it almost right. And by doing this, I hope that I've conveyed, and from responses from readers, I think I've succeeded, a much closer sense of the power and the subtlety and the sheer interestingness of the literary Hebrew of the Bible. Thank you very much. I'm happy to respond to your questions.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure for us to have a scholar of your renown with us today, and I appreciate your insights into your challenges in translating the Bible. Again, I have the copy right here. Is Amy's either birthday present or anniversary present. She asked, it's a little expensive, but it's worth it. And when I asked Amy this morning why she had me buy it, she said because it was too expensive for her to buy for herself. So if you are a serious student of the Bible, we get no revenues based on this, but I urge you to get this.
Yep.
So here are my questions. I think you mentioned that it's maybe coming out in paperback, so maybe people can look for that as well. I'm going to ask a few questions, and people are chatting their questions as well. I will try to moderate. You keep mentioning the JPS translation that you do not like, and you have referenced I was noticing the word you used, by committee. I guess, are you saying what made a big difference in your translation is that it was one person who did it, that you did it yourself, as opposed to, we all know what happens when you put things into committee. Is that one reason that the other translations may have failed?
Yeah, I would say that's half the reason. That is, I was one person, so I could make my own decisions and be consistent about them throughout. Also, I was one person with literary sensitivity to both the Hebrew and the English, which is not true of the JPS committee. And maybe a quick anecdote. I had a friend, I won't mention his name, who was on one of the JPS committees. He was a brilliant person, no longer alive, and a fine biblical scholar. When I finished Genesis, because we'd been friendly, I sent him a copy, and he wrote back trying to be tactful, but it was clearly he hated the translation. And one of the things he said, following the translation philosophy of the JPS people, was you repeatedly show and where the Hebrew has v, which you can't do in English. English won't tolerate and in the way that biblical Hebrew tolerates v. And I wrote back, I said, look, I've devoted a lot of my career to studying style in the English novel. And I can assure you that the structure of and is an important resource for master stylists in the English language. For my money, the greatest piece of extended prose poetry in the English language written in the 20th century is Molly Bloom's soliloquy at the end of James Joyce's Ulysses. And that's full of and. Okay.
You took us through different challenges or different things you considered when translating the Bible: rhythm, soundplay, wordplay, syntax, word choice, nuance. I think that works well for many parts of the Bible, but did you have challenges with it in some books like Leviticus?
Oh yeah, I have to say that when my translation of the 5 books of Moses came out, I met an acquaintance from our local conservative synagogue during the break at Yom Kippur. And he said, "But tell me, do you think that your translation of Leviticus put some zip into Leviticus?" I said, "No, Brad, I have to admit it didn't. But the only thing is the following. Leviticus, well, with the sacrificial instructions, were the lists of kosher animals and unkosher animals. There's nothing I could do. With certain features of Leviticus, like the instructions for the priests in inspecting houses for this particular kind of blight called sara'at, which is not leprosy, it's something else. The modern translations all use medical terms, like diagnose and prognosis and so forth. That's all wrong for Leviticus, which doesn't have any technical terms. So I said, and the priest should see and then follows the symptoms. So not inspect, not examine, but just plain see. So that's a slight difference, but it doesn't make Leviticus a riveting book.
You've talked a lot about your translations, and don't worry, everybody, I'm going to get to your questions. We have lots of questions, so if Professor Alter is willing to stay, we will get to as many as possible. But you also have notes. We were very fortunate to have Professor Daniel Matt, I mentioned, for a 3-part series on Gems of the Zohar, and he was our guide into the Zohar, which most of us certainly don't go into, but we do go into the Bible. We think we know the Bible, at least we see the Bible. If we go to synagogue every week, we are exposed to it. But you've added notes, and why don't you talk a little about the notes that you've added and what you were hoping to achieve, and give us an example of anything interesting, a particular note that will set the stage as to your other notes.
Well, to begin with, the notes really constitute a commentary. And at the beginning, I had no idea that I was going to produce a commentary. I figured, well, a few translators' notes, like such and such a term is a pun in the Hebrew and it's untranslatable, or this word is obscure in the Hebrew and any translation is conjectural. You have to do that. And also, you need to explain to readers certain ancient Israelite legal practices, marriage practices, and so forth. But before I got halfway through chapter 1 of Genesis, I realized that there were all kinds of things going on in the literary fashioning of the story that the existing commentaries don't talk about because they don't consider literary fashioning. So that's where I think the special interest in my commentary is. And well, I have commented on such things as I've illustrated this morning of rhythm, syntactic inversion, and so forth.
One question, it was a very specific question. One of our CSP members or participants was curious of how you treated Genesis 22:2, your son, your only one, your Yitzchak. If you had any different way of interpreting that particular section.
And I think I did comment on what I did in the note. The word order is extremely important. That is, the Hebrew sounds like that. Kachna et bincha et yidcha asher ahavta, and then at the end of the sentence, et Yitzchak. Now, Rashi and the Midrash Breshit Rabbah understood perfectly well why this word order is important. That is, I'll paraphrase Rashi. He says, take your son. Rashi and the Midrash invent an imaginary dialogue. Abraham says to God, but I have more than one son. Says, you're only one. This one is an only one to his mother, and this one is an only one to his mother, whom you love. And in the imaginary dialogue, is there any division in love? A father loves all his sons equally. And then at the end of the sentence, Isaac. So at this point, Abraham can't squirm out of it. He has to face the brutal truth that God wants him to take Isaac. So all that's conveyed through the word order. And every single English translation I have looked at changes the word order to make it sound, quote, more natural English. And that's terrible.
Professor Hubbard, who's with us online, wanted to know if you've ever translated a modern Hebrew novel or poetry.
Well, I've never translated a modern Hebrew novel. As many of you know, I have a deep interest in modern Hebrew, and I would say a near native command of modern Hebrew. I have translated a few stories by Agnon, which have appeared in print. And as to poetry, I've done incidental translations of poetry by Dan Pagis, by Leah Goldberg. But my big translation project with modern Hebrew poetry was about 5 or 6 years ago. I edited a large selection for Farrar Straus of the poetry of Yehuda Amichai, who I think is one of the great poets in any language in the 20th century. And I used a lot of translations by others, like my Berkeley friend Hannah Bloch, and now no longer with us, and Hannah Kornfeld did some fine translations of Amichai. But there were many poems that were great poems that had never been translated, and other poems for which I was unsatisfied with the translation. So I ended up doing maybe about 115 poems for this volume, which is a lot. Your sound went off.
Sorry, I don't know why we're having trouble today. People were having, I apologize in advance. Many of you were having trouble getting in early. I think today must be a big day on Zoom. 11 a.m. may be worse than our usual time at noon. So thank you for bearing with us. I also wanted to acknowledge, I wanted to mention this is our 67th CSP program online since we started doing online programming in March. This week we'll head to 70. And I wanted to thank Michael Kaftor, who's on, for being a champion of having Professor Alter with us. So thank you, Michael. The question was, what's your thoughts on the translation within the New Jerusalem Bible?
In some respects, it's a little, this is, I should say, a Catholic translation, also by committee. And I guess it's the most prevalent Catholic translation of the Bible at the moment. It's okay. In some respects, it's a little better than the JPS, but nevertheless, it's guilty of most of the sins of the modern uh, committees. That is, it doesn't have a great sense of literary English. It sometimes paraphrases the Hebrew rather than directly translate. Okay, I'll give you one tiny example. I mentioned before that the moderns seem to think readers don't understand metaphors. So in the Joseph story, when Joseph accuses his brothers of being spies, he says in the Hebrew, "Et ervat haaretz batem lirot," the nakedness of the land you have come to see. Now, to their credit, JPS does preserve the nakedness thing, which is crucial. The Jerusalem Bible and all the others say, well, people won't know what this refers to. So I don't remember which is which now, but they say things like, you've come to spy out the weak points in our defense. And that's appalling because nakedness is a sexual metaphor. It's the same word that's used in the incest taboos. So you've come to lay your eyes on things which no stranger should ever see.
What was interesting to me in thinking or listening to you is that I know many people who are yeshiva students who know the Hebrew very well, or rabbis, or in the more Haredi world or Orthodox world. But I don't think they appreciate the poetry. But they understand the words, but they don't appreciate the poetry. And then we have many people who can't read the Hebrew and so miss out on the beauty of the language and the syntax that you're trying to make available to us.
Can I make?
But they don't know the Hebrew. So you've brought the two together, and very much appreciated.
Can I make one comment about they understand the words?
Yes.
They usually understand the words, but they don't necessarily understand them precisely. As sometimes they get the words dead wrong. And then as in the case of my little disquisition on Birya, the nuanced meaning of Birya will never speak to them.
Okay. Rabbi Eli Spitz, our rabbi for many of us who are on in Congregation of B'nai Israel in Tustin, has been teaching a psalm, at least 1 to 3 psalms a week. His goal is to teach all of them, and I think he's up to close to 50 already. His question is, what is your favorite psalm and why?
Can I give 2 favorites?
Yes.
Okay. The first is Psalm 8. The one that begins, my God, how majestic is your name in all the earth. It's a kind of poetic replay of Genesis 1, of the creation story. And it's just beautifully articulated with this, in keeping with the vision of the priestly writer of the creation as a hierarchy, beginning with those who are just a little less than God, the celestial entourage, going down to all the beasts of the field and the fish in the sea. My other favorite psalm, I think, is 104, which is much longer, and it's a panoramic vision of the created world.
Okay. Martin Brower wants to know, well, I'll say it in a different way, but how long did you work on this translation, and did you work alone? Is this a solitary project, or did you
Okay.
consult with people? Oh,
I did a little consultation, not a lot. Um, so I began translating Genesis uh, probably around 1994 and completed the whole in maybe late 2017, or maybe sometime in 2017, and it came out at the end of 2018, so you can do the original. Uh, it was pretty much a solitary enterprise. I've never done much collaborative writing. I did collaborate with my wife many years ago on a critical biography of the French novelist Stendhal, but even there, I did all the writing and we just talked over each chapter. Um, I showed drafts up to a certain point, and then I didn't want to burden them, to two Berkeley friends. My colleague and good buddy Ron Hendel, who is the Berkeley professor of Bible, Hebrew Bible, who is a splendid biblical scholar. And so he would offer me from time to time certain corrections from his vast expertise in biblical scholarship, and that was helpful. And then I also showed it to, well, two friends, the last both now departed. Amos Finkelstein, a brilliant historian, was an Israeli with a mastery of biblical Hebrew. And alas, I was translating Genesis when he was dying of cancer. But we consulted together right to the end. And he often had challenging and interesting insights. He was a man who could think through problems in fresh ways that had been thought about 1,000 times. And then I had another friend also fell to cancer somewhat later, Michael Andre Bernstein, who was a literary scholar and my colleague in comparative literature at Berkeley, also my tennis partner, which is the strongest bond between two men. And Michael was very brilliant and had a very finely adjusted literary sensibility. He did not know Hebrew. So that was an interesting perspective because he would read every draft very carefully, and from a literary perspective, sometimes he would offer suggestions, like you're overdoing syntactic inversion here, or at, at the beginning of Job's first poem, in Job 3, I think I had, for the sake of what's, W-H-I-T apostrophe S. Like I said, you can't do that because a contraction like that is too informal for biblical poetry. And I realized it was right. But these are just limited consultations.
Howard Merowitz asks, how much are your translations influenced by different Jewish commentaries? Philo, Targum, Midrash, Rambam, Ramban. He gave examples of mystical interpretations, or even contemporary interpreters like Aviva Zornberg, or not as contemporary, Spinoza. Which commentaries, if any, have you found most helpful in this endeavor?
Aviva Zornberg didn't influence me an iota. I kind of find her mix of Freudianism and English department post reading. It has its moments, but it doesn't attract me. I definitely benefited from time to time from the classical midrash, the midrash rabbah. I, from time to time, I found a few medieval Hebrew commentators quite helpful. My favorite, in a way, is Avraham ibn Ezra, who was not only a canny biblical commentator, but actually was maybe the first comparative Semiticist, because he knew Arabic, and sometimes he would draw on his knowledge of Arabic in parsing a Hebrew word. But he was a poet, and he was quite a good poet. So he's sensitive to the poetic nuances of the Hebrew. Rashi, of course, often offered insights, and in a way I gave an illustration before with the Akedah story and the word order in God's first speech to Abraham. Occasionally, Radak, that is Kimchi, is useful, and a few others.
It's a little hard to hear you. I mean, I don't know if your microphone is.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. A few more quick questions since we have you, if you will bear with us. One question by Edward, I think it's either Latcher or Lacher. Do you look at trope at all to influence your translations?
Very occasionally. This is the thing that the trope, of course, are in part a parsing of the syntax and even the meaning of the Hebrew. Here and there, I might have picked up a momentary insight, but not much. And I have to say that there are often places where the trope gets the syntax wrong.
Okay. This is a really good question. With multiple authors of the Tanakh, do you factor in the difference in the language based on the time period in which they lived in your translations?
In one way, yes, and another, no. That is, I'll begin with the multiple sources of the Torah. Between the E source and the J source, I can see that they come from different places, but not that they're stylistically different. So I didn't try to do anything with that. The difference between the two of them and the priestly source is palpable. The priestly prose, when it's going well, say like as in the flood story, or in the creation story, has a kind of formal grandeur that is different from the ENP, and I tried to get that. Then Deuteronomy, is totally different. It's a style of oratory, befitting the fact that it's Moses' valedictory address. And it uses these long, rolling, periodic sentences. And I try to be faithful to that and make them sound different from E, J, and P. Now, as time passes, although maybe biblical Hebrew in its early centuries doesn't change quite as much as other languages, by the time you get to the period of the Babylonian exile and the Persian period, Hebrew sounds rather different. And I try to get to the difference of the sound there.
In recognition that we've kept you a little late, I'll ask just one or two more questions, and then we'll end it here. Well, one person, this doesn't count in my questions. One person asked, "How do we learn more with you? We've enjoyed it so much. Are you teaching online? Did they have to go enroll in Berkeley? Of course, if they enrolled in Berkeley, they couldn't be in a class with you right now, but they could, because you're not having classes. But are you speaking online? Are you teaching online? Is there another way to study text with you or learn from you?"
No, I'm not regularly teaching online or lecturing online. Um, I think that some of my lectures are actually accessible on YouTube. You can look into that. I have not. And I would say that there are two books of mine which are available in paperback. They're not expensive. Which is how I got onto the Bible in the first place. I wasn't supposed to be doing this. I wasn't minding my own business as a scholar. The Art of Biblical Narrative and the Art of Biblical Poetry. And I think they're written in a rather accessible way, and they say a lot of what I want to say about the Bible.
Um, what do you teach right now at Berkeley?
Well, I've been retired for a while, which considering my age is not too surprising. So I've been teaching one course a year in retirement, but I do love teaching. And uh, I alternate between comparative literature and Hebrew. I had a split appointment. A quarter of it was in Near Eastern Studies, and the rest in Comp Lit. So in Comp Lit, that's not relevant to today's talk. Well, just obliquely, I teach a course on literary translation, which is basically a kind of workshop. The students have translation project. On the Hebrew side, um, I've done a couple of different things. I've done a course not too long ago. These are all graduate seminars on medieval Hebrew poetry, which is not my main field, but it's a body of poetry I love. And then with my colleague Ron Hendel, we've taught a series of courses that combine modern Hebrew with the Bible, where we choose the biblical text, let's say Isaiah, and we study that text as you would study uh, a biblical text in a graduate seminar. And I put together a reader of modern Hebrew poems, which we read in the Hebrew, that relate to that text. And that's very illuminating. Um, Now, Ron Hendel and I are scheduled to team teach an introduction to the Hebrew Bible in the spring semester of this coming academic year. And maybe that will be available online. I don't know.
Awesome. So, last question that we have time for, and there are many more. Um, since you published the collection of your translation of the entire Tanakh, what criticism have you received, and what do you, and is any of it warranted from your perspective?
Well, most of the reviews, I have to say, have been extremely enthusiastic, and in prominent places, uh, in the in the New Yorker, the Wall Street Journal, and of course, not a review, but it referred to the translation in the uh, New York Times Magazine article, in which the writer said that he thought my translation could easily replace the King James Version. Now, I'm aware of basically one um, highly qualified uh, review and then one negative, very negative review. Now, the negative review, I have to say, was in Commentary, where I used to be a regular contributor, and eventually we parted company without a formal divorce because our political paths had gone in different directions. And the Commentary became ardently neoconservative. I didn't like neoconservatism, was kind of an old-fashioned liberal. And I actually had written scathing critiques of two commentary neoconservative faithfuls. So I didn't want to read this review because I thought it was politically slanted. I thought that it was political paper, but there was a review in commentary which apparently was an out and out attack. Then there was a review online by Phil Halkin, who was a prominent translator and literary journalist. And I've known Hillel personally since he was a teenager. He's a very smart man and has done some fine things. But Hillel has an impulse to be what you call in Yiddish, a Nachweiser, someone who always knows better than you. So he began by bristling with the fact that people were calling this the first English translation by a single person. And he cited 4 or 5 examples going back to the 19th century, a couple of them by women, of translations by one person. Although these, I think, mostly were translations not from the Hebrew, but from translations from translation. So for my money, that doesn't qualify. And then he said, Phil said a number of nice things about my translation, and then he objected to certain translation choices. And I was not moved to take these very seriously. To me, they fell under the rubric of quibbles. That is, I did it one way, he might have done it another way, or there were places where, as I confessed to you this morning, there's not much you can do, and my solution was an imperfect solution.
Well, you explained how you didn't intend to go out and write this translation of the whole Tanakh. We learned how you did it basically all by yourself. It's an immense work. It's a great contribution to all of us. So I wanted to thank you for sharing this work with us and fundamentally changing how we read and understand our own tradition and wisdom literature. And I wanted to thank you for taking time to be with us today. And I wanted to thank everybody who participated in the program and asked great questions. I hope we can have you back and learn some text with you. And everybody, thank you. Have a great Sunday. Enjoy. It's the last Sunday of July. Then we get August. Then you know what's coming around the corner. Yes, it's true. So I won't mention it because we have rabbis and professionals on there who are already shaking because they know. But thank you very much, Professor Alter. Everybody else, I will put you on the screen for 1 second if I can. Thank you. I see Ahuva clapping. Thank you, Ahuva, for all you do for the community. Sorry for the challenges we had on Zoom. I do not control Zoom. I just use it, so I did the best I could. Have a great, well, I'm trying to get you guys on the screen together, and it won't allow me to do it. So with that, I will say goodbye. I'm going to spend quality time with my kids. Oh, there you are. Okay. Bye, everybody. Bye, Howard. Bye, Rita. I'm glad you made it on there. Hunter Kaplan, thank you for your email. Michael Rubin, couldn't get to your question today, but thank you for sharing it. We have lots to learn. Every time we learn something, we have lots more questions. I don't know if it's probably a human trait, but it's definitely a Jewish trait. Dale Schatz, good to see you. Professor Alter, we'll talk soon. And everybody else, have a great Sunday. Keep safe, please. Bye-bye.